All right, good afternoon, ancient history students. This is your lecture for Wednesday, April 22nd, and we're going to be looking at chapter 77 in Bauer, entitled The Problems of Prosperity. So we're picking up the story now, the timeline moving from the Gracchi and that entire episode of trying to fix the problems of class and land and economic equality in the Republic. And so the period of time we're looking at is 118 to 73 BC. So we're kind of speeding toward the beginning of the Anno Domini, right? The incarnation, which if we're talking about history generally, that is the biggest moment in human history, is when God actually arrived in time. Because up until that point, God was outside of time, but he actually entered the world. And so we're getting close to this. And so part of the drama of Rome is that you're seeing, the Republic kind of break apart. And, in some ways, the efforts of human beings to try to create a just society. But who's going to come shortly to kind of show what a really true just society is? That's Christ. So anyway, but right now we're looking at this effort of trying to keep the Republic alive, but slowly but surely we're looking at kind of the painful decline of the Republic. Those who were living through it didn't think that the Republic was dying, but certainly there were some major problems, particularly in terms of corruption and in terms of demagoguery, which is this idea that a politician can kind of appeal in an emotional, emphatic way to the rank and file of the common man and make them a bunch of promises, and in order to kind of gain power. And so this problem of demagoguery is something that faces all popular systems of government, and Rome was certainly no exception to that. Let me you should have finished your Google Forms assignment from the Gracchi brothers today. So hopefully that's in your that's completed. I need to take a look at some of the stuff for this week. I'll do some grading over the weekend so we can get you up to date. And then this lecture, the assignment, the homework assignment will be due on Friday. Okay. And again, the homework, the reading is in chapter 77. There's a portion of it that deals with Chinese history, which of course we're not dealing with. So it's 668 to 673, and then it picks up again with the Roman story, 676 to 679. So it's a pretty quick chapter, but really it's I would say the Gracchi is the turning point, and at this point forward, it's just one kind of disaster after another from the perspective of trying to keep the Republic. Okay, so let me just read you a little bit from Bauer, and I think it's there are times in the book where she really writes beautifully, and I think this is one example of that. She writes, after the disaster of the Gracchi, it was clear that new laws were not going to bring any solution to the growing problems of poverty and landlessness. So this is an historian, writing in the 20th century, who's basically saying that, looking from hindsight, that there was no amount of lawmaking, no amount of political reform that was going to fix the problem, which is kind of sad. I hope that we live in an era where we still have an opportunity to maybe change some things to make our republic improve. But looking at this episode, a 20th century American historian is basically saying that it was kind of over. So these efforts were based, and so one of the questions you have to think about is why will new laws not fix the problems? She continues, the Roman Constitution, the elaborate system of tribunes and consuls, senators, judges, checks and balances, against something that we like to highlight in our system, would neither bring nor prevent justice. Kind of a sad thought, right? So this elaborate system of constitutional structures is not going to prevent injustice from occurring. The will of the rich or the charisma of the popular could always subvert it. So that's kind of those are the two kind of um, subversive elements here in the republic. You've got basically a massive influx of wealth that's coming into the republic from their overseas conquests, and as a result, that money is getting funneled through political officials, and they're taking that money and they're using it. And then you also have people who are in the economy who are using their newfound wealth to manipulate the political process. Today, you would maybe make an analogy to people who provide campaign contributions to elected officials. And then he says the charisma of the popular. So you got one problem, which is, good old-fashioned financial economic corruption, money infecting politics. The second problem is these kind of new politicians that are going to emerge on the scene. And we're going to talk about two of them, Marius and Sulla, who are going to kind of appeal to the masses, not only through speech making, but through military conquest. So one of the new ways of getting into political power is through military. And so the military, you don't have to be a patrician or connected in order to serve in the military and rise through the ranks, so to speak. And so this double problem of financial corruption, coupled with the demagoguery of charismatic politicians, particularly military leaders, could always subvert the Republican Constitution of Rome. New laws were not going to bring any solution to the growing problem of poverty and landlessness. Almost every Roman orator looked back wistfully to a golden age, quote, before the destruction of Carthage. Remember Marcus Cato, right? Cato the Elder, talking about, always wanting to destroy Carthage. And so there were people who say, before Carthage, before the Punic Wars, Rome was this wonderful republic where all the different orders and the patricians and the plebeians were getting along with each other. Now, we know, having looked back, is that was there ever really a golden age of the Roman Republic? There was always conflict, but that's kind of the point. When you give ordinary people power and influence, you're always going to get what we call factions. And so trying to control these factions and not eliminate them, because that would prevent liberty, but to kind of channel them through institutions, that's kind of the way, that's the American solution. So there's this idea that, and we kind of look at that too. I have to admit, I sometimes fall into that trap of saying, it was, at the founding, the Constitution really worked. Well, Jefferson hated Aaron Burr, and Hamilton hated both of them, and Adams hated all three, and they were backstabbing in the Washington administration. We're talking about the beginning of the country's history, and then you look at the Civil War. So was there ever really a golden age in American politics? Certainly when you're living through an age, it's hard, it's hard to think that your age would ever be considered a golden age. But sometimes, I guess, part of being a good historian is looking back and seeing if there were times that were better or worse, depending upon the circumstances. But at this point, you have a lot of people in Rome saying, I wish we could go back to the time before the Punic Wars, when the Roman Republic was pure, right? And you think about, the taking down Tarquin's superbus and the establishment of the Republic. But remember, they needed a dictator 8 years after, so there was always problems. And maybe that's one of the lessons, is that, if you're looking for heaven on earth and heaven by man-made products, and you're going to be looking long and hard for that. Down to the destruction of Rome, the Roman historian Sulla wrote a few years later, echoing the lament of the times, the people and the Senate shared the government peaceably and with due restraint. And the enemies did not compete for glory or power. Fear of its enemies preserved the good morals of the state. Now that, to me, that sounds actually like a pretty good theory. That actually it was the common enemy that kind of brought the different factions, the rich and the poor, the plebeians and the patricians together, united in the face of an enemy onslaught, particularly if you think about somebody like Hannibal. But without that kind of unifying factor, Rome is so powerful now that there are always enemies out there, but they don't seem to put up much of a fight. And so she concludes by saying there had never been such a time was beside the point. Romans needed to look back with longing to an imaginary golden age in order to cope with the present. Because Rome had once been pure, but now is filled with greed, corruption, pride, decadence, and other fruits of prosperity. And so then she starts talking about something called the Jugurthine War, which we'll get into right now. Excuse me one moment. Come here. You want to come in? Dog doesn't want to come in. Maybe later. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about his name is Jugurtha, and he is part of a power struggle in Numidia. If you remember, Numidia had kind of caused some of the trouble between Carthage and Rome during the Third Punic War. Remember, Cato goes down. He's trying to deal with this problem that King Massinissa is causing. He's prepared to find a kind of a downtrodden Carthage, and he finds actually a pretty healthy society. And it's that point that he comes back and eventually urges Rome to take up arms, and Scipio, the grandson of Scipio, ends up taking a force over there with Tiberius Gracchus to actually defeat the Carthaginians for good, basically just raise the city of Carthage to the ground. So King Massinissa was getting up in years, and so there's a power struggle about who's going to take over. He's got a couple of sons and also a nephew, and his nephew is Jugurtha. And Jugurtha is kind of he's a political maneuverer and operator, and he is able to basically bribe his way to the throne of Numidia. And so he actually, and this is part of the problem, is that, and this gets into, it actually becomes a Roman political problem, because Jugurtha Numidia is a realm, kind of a province of Rome at this point. And so Jugurtha wants to be part of the Roman system, and he is a wealthy man, and he's trying to use his influence and use his money to kind of change the laws and get him positioned to be in power. And this becomes kind of a, imagine if somebody was bribing their way to the top, it would be a political sensation in the United States as well. The public, Bauer writes, was indignant that the Senate was not going to deal with this with this problem of Jugurtha and widespread corruption that his case actually demonstrated. And so it took a while. Actually, he took over in 118 BC, and it took a while for somebody to emerge that was willing to take this matter on, this corruption on, and this idea that the city and political office was up for kind of the highest bidder. And his name, the person that came, kind of emerged in this scene to try to, in some ways bring back Roman Republican virtue, was a guy by the name of Gaius Marius. And he was considered a new man. And what that meant was, this was somebody who had kind of risen to political and military leadership, not because of family connection, but because of his own exploits. Come on. Oh, come on. Okay. Lay down. Okay. And so he ends up going back down. He goes down to Numidia, and he is appointed as a general to capture Jugurtha. So he was during his fighting, he was actually elected to be consul in 107 BC, and he has some help. One of his senior officers is a guy by the name of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, and so Marius and Sulla are going to be on the Roman political stage for a good long time. Okay, so it took him about 3 years, but Marius finally captures Jugurtha and brings him back in chains back, and parades him in front of the Roman people. And this just makes, I mean, if there was Twitter back then, he'd be tweeting out, look what I did. I just brought this kind of politically corrupt person back into Rome. He was manipulating our political system, and now I've got him. And so he was hailed as Rome's champion. Now, he had been elected consul, and of course, if you remember the Roman system, consuls were, it was a 1-year term, and then you would have to, step aside for somebody else, and there was not just one, that there was two. But, Marius doesn't, he's like, well, I'm not really sure what the Constitution says on that, and, maybe this is a crisis. And now he doesn't run for dictator, he's not appointed dictator, but what he ends up doing is he says, I want to run for consul again. And they elect him. And then he runs for consul again. And they elect him. So he does this for 6 straight times. Now, it's kind of like fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice or 6 times, shame on me. So who's electing Marius against the Roman Constitution? It's the people. So if the people are actually acknowledging and recognizing or not recognizing constitutional provisions, then, somebody like Marius, like, hey, if they like me, what's the big problem? I'm just going to continue to run for office. He actually, reminds me a little bit about what's going on today with immigration. There are people who want to make people who've come to this country without a legal process, without a green card, or trying to go through the citizenship process correctly. They want to give them citizenship now, right? And actually, during the Obama administration, there were efforts to use an executive order to do something like that. This kind of reminds me of this. He says, Marius awarded citizenship to 1,000 Italian allies as a reward for their help in battle, which of course was against the Constitution. He famously said, I'm sorry, but the noise of fighting prevented me from hearing the law. In other words, he was saying, look, I was too busy protecting and expanding Rome's influence. What could be the big deal? Okay, so here's a guy, and this is what we mean by this kind of charismatic leader. He's trying to stamp out political corruption, but in doing so, he's using methods that are contrary to the Roman Constitution. So this, we're kind of hearkening back to the problem with the Gracchi, which is, do the ends justify the means of breaking the Constitution? Okay, so Marius is kind of, he becomes a fixture on the stage in Roman politics during this period of time. Now, so this is 107, 104, 10, basically 98. So he's he's getting up in years, and he ends up deciding that after the 7th time as consul that was too much. So he ends up retiring, quote unquote. Now the problem with Marius is that he retires and then he comes back. Then he retires, then he comes back. Okay. Now during this particular time, remember the whole Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus wanted to do this. They wanted to expand the notion of citizenship beyond just the Roman borders. They wanted to give it to all the Italian cities in the peninsula, and maybe even in Sicily as well. And so there was a fair amount. The expectations had been raised among these Italian and Latin allies to become citizens, but still there was balking by the Senate and kind of a resistance to giving these people full voting rights. And so there's some discontent brewing among these regions, Campania and Capua, places in the south, as well as in the north, where Etrusca and all of that, where they want Roman citizenship and they're not being granted to it. And so it's kind of it's a combination of a kind of like a civil war, although not exactly right, and it's also an ethnic war, where different ethnicities with kind of a common heritage, but also different language, especially among the common citizens. And so there's kind of almost like a mini revolt that ends up happening among the Latins, and they actually form a league of non-Roman cities called the Italia League. And actually, you hear the name that will actually be on our lips as we move toward the birth of Christ and the death of the Republic, Julius Caesar. But there was a council, one of the co-councils from the Julii Caesarius clan, that actually they were aristocratic but poor, meaning that they were from patrician stock, but they had grown poor, and they argued that there should be citizenship granted to allies who did not rebel. So there's this kind of, hey, if we bring in another constituency, that there might be an opportunity to gain some political support. And if you think about how immigration as a political issue is handled in the United States, there's clearly one political party who sees it as an advantage to be for easy immigration into the United States, because they think that they might get helped politically. They also might think it's just the right thing to do, but there's also electoral considerations. And that was the same case with this Julii Caesarius clan. And that's where Julius Caesar is going to come from, that particular family. So there is an outbreak of fighting called the Social War. And when that breaks out, these rebellions among these Italian allies to Rome, Marius comes out of retirement and is given a command in the northern part of Italy. His chief lieutenant, Sulla, is given command of the southern Roman legions and is sent to put down rebellions in the south. And so this fight goes on for about 3 years. And Sulla is about 20 years younger than Marius, and he has much more success militarily than Marius. And so when he returns, he's given a parade, and he is elected consul, and Marius is left to kind of stew in his own juices. And so there's a brewing conflict and animosity that's growing mostly on the part of Marius towards Sulla. Again, Sulla had been junior to Marius, and now he's this upstart, and he's taking over, and Marius doesn't like him. And so at that point, after Sulla is elected consul, there had been an uprising, not an uprising, but an increase in power in Asia Minor from a region called the Kingdom of Pontus. All right, so I'll show you this. This map is on 672. All right, so it hugs the Black Sea. It might even be kind of near where maybe Hannibal met his fate. And remember, he was killed on the banks of the Black Sea. And so um, the Roman Senate says, you know what, we're going to send you out to to defeat this, this new threat to Roman hegemony in the area. And so Sulla says, I'm ready to do it, and so he begins to ready his forces for an invasion of Asia Minor. At that point, Marius wants back in. He wants to be given that command. He doesn't want to have this political upstart Sulla take all the glory. So he ends up bribing a number of political officials to be given to fight for having him be given the command of this army to defeat Pontus. And so there's a new tribune army that is given command, that gives command to Marius. And Marius actually sends two tribunes. Sulla is training his army outside the walls of Rome, which is where you're supposed to do it. And when the two tribunes came to say, hey, you've been relieved of command, Sulla had both of them stoned to death. And so basically a civil war breaks out, which, you think about what happens in a free society. This is where factional disputes are at its height. You've actually got two sides behind two different leaders, Marius and Sulla, and they're organizing militarily to fight each other. And so Sulla does a huge no-no. He decides that he's going to break the Constitution and march his army inside the walls of Rome. So all up until this point, up until the 86, 85 BC, no Roman army had ever marched inside the gates of Rome. So there was always this concern that you would keep civilian control over the government and not have a military strongman take over. But Sulla is making the argument that, look, I have to do this because my enemy Marius is actually corrupting the system before me. So I have to, and this is always dangerous when you hear this, I have to break the Constitution to save the Constitution. Okay? So he comes in and he ends up basically rounding up Marius's supporters and rounding them up and killing them in the streets. So it is it's with the Gracchi, this was a kind of almost like I wouldn't call it a coup, but it was almost like a political assassination. It was behind the scenes, and the rank and file weren't really involved with it. By the time you get to Marius and Sulla, you've got two military leaders with their own military units, and the rank and file are actually carrying out the orders of these two different factional armies. And so it's not just a little rebellion or a coup inside the coup. It's really a civil war. At that point, Marius flees to North Africa. This is 87 BC. New elections are to take place, and a gentleman by the name of Lucius Cinna, Cinna, becomes the second consul to Sulla. Now, he's not a particular ally or friend of Sulla, but he's also an enemy of Marius, or at least he says he is. So Sulla agrees to, Cinna agrees to share power with Sulla. At that point, Sulla thinks it's safe to actually depart Rome for Asia Minor so he can go out and have his military conquest, expand the Roman Republic to new lands, and basically become a political or military hero. And so he ends up marching his troops eastward toward Asia Minor, going through Thrace. Obviously you have to get on a ship, go over to Macedonia, and then march through the Hellespont and get to Pontus. As he starts to do that, Cinna is thrown out of Rome. The gates are locked, and he begins collecting an army. Marius then returns once again. This is the third time he has returned from North Africa. He's rather theatrical, as Bauer describes him. He's dressed in rags. He's kind of playing up this kind of pity party, that woe is me kind of argument. And the Senate basically sends messengers to Sulla that, hey, your political opponents are taking over the city again. You might want to do something about it. And so what Sulla does, which is kind of clever, is that he sends the message back saying, okay, I'm returning to Rome. Now, he really didn't have the intent of returning immediately to Rome. He said, he basically comes back in 3 years. But he ends up kind of sending a message that, hey, you better watch out here, because you don't know when I'm going to be coming back. In the meantime, he puts down a rebellion in Greece and then moves on to Pontus. Now, a year later, Marius, who had grown extremely old, ends up dying in 86 BC. They think it's as a result of alcoholism. So you can kind of see, too, and both of these men are kind of reflections of that. They start out as these kind of almost idealistic political and military leaders. They're going to try to stop corruption in the society. But then they kind of become part of the problem, and they become decadent and corrupt themselves. And Marius was no different. It sounded like he kind of lived very high off the hog. And so he ends up dying in 86 BC. But just because he's dead, there are people who would support kind of his faction, his party, that continue to fight for power in Rome. And of course, Sulla is getting all these different reports. And so finally in 83 BC, he returns to Rome. And many senators go out beyond the gates to greet him. Cinna tried to gather an army to fight Sulla, but his men actually mutinied and killed him in the process. So there's really nobody standing in the way militarily between Sulla and his political position. But there were still people loyal to Marius and Cinna inside the gate. So he also marches his soldiers in, and reports to the Senate. And he's telling the Senate what he had done in Pontus and how he was able to defeat this growing power. He actually, there were two, and these are two people that you'll have to remember for later on. There were two young officers that were serving in Sulla's army at the time, Pompey and Crassus. And so that they, along with Julius Caesar, are going to make up what we call the first triumvirate, right? Which is, again, another unconstitutional element of this late Roman Republic, which is just hopelessly corrupt and hopelessly or unconstitutional. So Marius' son takes over the resistance, but when Sulla comes in, he orders his troops to round up all of these supporters of Marius and Cinna and put them into the Circus Maximus. And so there's this not wonderful, but this just kind of dramatic scene where Sulla, just kind of in a cool, calm, way, is saying, okay, this is what I did. And he's basically saying, thank you for your support, and now I have expanded Rome's influence even further into Asia. And while he's talking, there are these just blood-curdling screams that are emanating all around the city, particularly where the Circus Maximus is. And so the senators are like, what's going on? He goes, oh, there's nothing. Everything's going to be okay. And so when his speech is over, people learn that all 6,000 of these rebels had their throats slit and cut by Sulla's thugs. So I mean, this guy is a bloodthirsty, brutal ruler, and he ends up kind of becoming what the Greeks would call a tyrant, not kind of a dictator in the constitutional sense, or not even really like what a formal Greek tyrant would be. This is a tyranny. This is somebody who is exploiting his rule for his own gain. So he continues to purge his political enemies. Some actually managed to flee. Cinna's son-in-law, so remember Cinna had taken up power when Sulla had left, and he had allied himself with the elder Marius. Well, do you know who Cinna's son-in-law was? His name was Julius Caesar. So can you imagine how Roman history would have been different if Cinna and, if Julius Caesar had actually been rounded up and killed during Sulla's purge. So he actually escapes into northern Italy and doesn't come back for a while. Pompey chases Marius's allies to Sicily and North Africa. Crassus finds and basically helps to also chase down certain enemies to Sulla. And what he ended up doing, he would set fire to his political enemies, and then he would have firemen that he had bribed come and put out the fire, and then he would end up extorting and basically buying up this land. So this is where we get the word being crass. That comes from being like Crassus, because he's all about kind of stealing easy money from the system. So it's a real mess. And so by 80 BC, Sulla retired after stealing and murdering most of his political his political enemies, and he spent his last years in kind of just awful decadence. They believe that he died of a cirrhosis of the liver. So again, Marius dies of alcoholism, Sulla dies of alcoholism, and so there's this actually. I think I'll actually read it because it's a little disgusting, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's emblematic. So you can think about Sulla and Sulla's body at the end of his life as almost like a personification of what had happened to the Roman Republic by the end of his life. So she writes, this is on page 678, having gotten everything that he could out of Rome, Sulla retired in 80 BC and went to the country. Here he married again and ended up becoming promiscuous. All of this activity notwithstanding, he was in poor health, probably suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. Quote, for a long time he failed to observe that his bowels were ulcerated, till at length the corrupted flesh broke out into lice. So he's so disgusting inside his body that he actually, lice had been living inside of his bowels. Many were employed day and night in destroying them, but the work so multiplied that not only his clothes, baths, basins, but his very flesh was polluted with flux and contagion. They came swarming out in such numbers. In this disgusting condition, he passed his last years, like the Republic, fatally ill, but lingering on and pretending to good health. So Sulla is just a great example of, the edifice is still up, the Republic is still functioning, but it's a complete shell of itself. And, if you think about like walking through a forest and you walk through trees that are rotted and dead, right? But they're still standing, but there's no life in them. That's another analogy. The issue is who's going to come and push the rotten tree over, right? No one has done that yet, but it's going to happen soon. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 78. So I want you for Friday to read think, let's see here. Yeah, this is a long chapter, so we're not going to get through all of this. So I believe it's page 682. We're going to get to Spartacus and the slave revolts, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, so basically 680 to 687. So you're going to see it's called the Gladiator War. You're going to have this Pompey and Crassus, the rise of the first triumvirate, and then you also read about Cicero, and so we'll actually read a little bit in Plutarch on Cicero. I think he's in that book, and we'll get up to the point where Caesar ends up moving outside of Rome and considering military exploits all the way to Great Britain and to England. Okay, so that's it. Do that Google Forms assignment for Friday. Okay, thank you very much.